All right, good morning, everyone. Hope everyone is doing okay on this sunny Monday morning. Hope the exam went well for you. So everyone's got it in. I will grade those and get that back to you as soon as I can. My goal is by Wednesday, if not Wednesday, by Friday, but I know it's nice to have your grades returned as soon as you can. So we'll get that back to you. We're gonna start something new today. You can see we got Bruce Lee here showing off his own muscles, and we're gonna dive into the next big unit in class. This is one of the longer units in class. It's a little more involved. We actually have 2 labs on this topic, as well as probably a couple weeks or so or lectures. So this will take us probably through spring break and probably a little bit past that as well. Before we jump into new stuff, what questions do you have? Cool. All right, let's do it then. Today's agenda looks like this. We're going to start off. I want to introduce the topic of muscles and get you going with that. And then I have a super fun learning activity. And notice the hat with the confetti and stuff. That's like your indication. That's like your verbal cue or visual cue that that's like really fun. So just here, I can do this. Watch, it's coming. Wait for it. There it is. Everyone got that? That means that part of class is going to be really great. I just want to make that clear. It's just a little trick I use in my presentations. And then we're going to continue talking about the gross anatomy of muscles, get into that. You're going to learn the longest muscle of your body, which some of you might know if you took 251 or just might know from other places. Does anyone know what that is? Don't say it out loud. Does anyone know what the longest muscle in your body is? You know it. Don't say it. I don't want to give it away just yet, but you know, you got it. All right. So that means that for an Ella, you probably know this from 251. We covered it. Who else did I have 251 with? Yeah, Casey, do you remember from last semester?
I think so.
Okay. Well, that's good then, because that builds a suspense. So the class is going to be like a really good movie today, because there'll be like some, setup of the plot, and then there's like a fun part of it, and then like the suspension's going to build, and at a certain point, you're going to find out what that longest muscle in your body is, and you'll be like the climax of the movie. And then we have like what they call the denouement in plot terms. And that's to wrap up in your ticket out. That's kind of the leveling out at the end of that. So I just want to give you the narrative arc of our lecture for today. And let's get started. I want to talk about muscles. So muscle comes from the Latin word, whoop, too many slides. Latin comes from the, excuse me, let me start that over. The word muscle comes from the Latin for little mouse, which I will not pretend to understand. Apparently the idea is that when you're contracting your muscles, it looks like a mouse is running or something under your skin. I don't know. Maybe when we look at Bruce Lee, that makes a little more sense. But there it is. And I want to emphasize here that muscle is, as a tissue, is a complex tissue that contains both muscle cells. So remember from our histology section in your histology lab, we looked at muscle cells under the microscope. But there's also connective tissue surrounding those cells. So I want to just emphasize here that we have muscle cells and we have muscle tissue. Right now, we're going to focus primarily on muscle tissue in this unit, how these muscles function as a whole. We are not going to get into the subcellular anatomy of muscle cells. We're not going to get into cross-bridge cycling and myosin and actin and all that fun stuff. That we'll save that for your physiology courses. We touch on it in 251, and if you take human anatomy, what's that, 325, I think, with Dr. Panwis, you'll get into that in more detail. But we're just going to cover the anatomy here, and it's probably disappointing to some of you that we're really looking to learn how calcium interacts with tropomyosin, troponin. Maybe Casey, Ella, who else has 251 with me? You guys, this all should sound familiar, right? You're like, damn, I know exactly what this guy's talking about. Okay, and what's notable about muscle tissue is that we have lots of it, and that in fact it makes up about half of the mass of our body is made up of different kinds of muscle tissue. So overwhelmingly, it's the most prevalent kind of tissue in the body in terms of sheer volume of this kind of tissue. So we have a lot of this stuff in our body. It takes up a lot of space. It takes up a lot of energy. What the heck does it do? Well, it does a lot of different things, actually. The first is that it produces movement. So this is the thing that you're probably most familiar with, or that comes to mind first when you're thinking about muscles. In this, what I want to emphasize here is this movement can take different forms. Either the movement of our limbs or appendages, for example. So for example, a flexing of the arm, a movement of the leg to allow you to walk. Those are forms of movement. But other movement includes the continuous and repetitive contraction of heart. That is muscle action. The movement of food and liquids through your digestive system, that's movement internally, right? The dilation and the closing of your pupils in your eyes, that's movement, and that is controlled by muscle tissue. So all of these different forms of movement are included here. And I want to emphasize that this is kind of internal movement and also external. It's us walking and crawling and running and swimming and climbing and all of those things as well. One form of this movement is opening and closing body passages. So I mentioned the pupil of the eye. This is also true for the digestive tract, also true for blood vessels. There's smooth muscles surrounding those blood vessels. These kinds of muscles are called sphincters. Sphincter simply refers to a muscle that opens and closes a passageway. And so we have sphincters in our digestive system in several places to kind of keep things flowing in the right direction at the right speed. We have sphincters that control blood vessels, et cetera, et cetera. Now, muscles help provide movement, but importantly, they also do the opposite. They help provide stability and stabilization. So in many cases, we're using our muscles to move, but in other cases, we're using our muscles. It takes energy simply not to move. And so, for example, maintaining your posture and stabilizing your joints. So I'm standing here right now motionless, but I'm using a lot of muscles to maintain my balance and maintain that structure even as I'm motionless. So even though we generally think of muscles as producing movement, what's important is that they also work to prevent movement when we don't want it. This is true across joints as well. It helps to stabilize joints. We talked about these synovial joints that have a lot of flexibility, right? We talked about the trade-off with that is that they don't have as much structural integrity. They can move in ways maybe we don't want them to. But importantly, we've talked about how muscle tone is one way that those synovial joints stay stabilized and maintain their movement in the direction that we want and prevents movement in directions that we don't want. And finally, muscles are important for heat generation. So we can do something called shivering thermogenesis when we're really cold and you shiver. That's your muscles kind of repeatedly contracting, and that creates friction and releases energy in the form of heat because your muscles aren't terribly efficient at utilizing energy. So when they're converting, carbohydrates and using oxygen to make ATP, they're kind of bad at it, and they release a lot of extra energy as heat. Now, in some cases, this is great. This keeps us warm when we're cold, for example, when we're shivering. In other cases, this is a big problem. If you're out exercising or doing something, running, whatever, on a hot day, that is not good, and your problem becomes getting rid of this excess heat. And I've talked a lot in this class about our hard problem as humans, physiologically, is more often being too hot than too cold. And this is definitely part of this is this inefficiency of the muscles and this heat that's generated when we use them a lot. And so because of this, we have other adaptations to dump off heat, like the thing that we're the best at in the whole animal kingdom, which is what? Sweating. Yes, Ethan, question.
Is that from an evolutionary sense on purpose, or is it just a process that's really hard to make more?
You mean the like releasing of heat from the muscles?
Like the cells like being efficient.
Yeah, that is a really interesting question. So the first thing I would say is that remember, nothing in evolution is on purpose. Yeah. Things in evolution happen kind of by chance or by random mutations, and then it's either advantageous for the organism and provides a differential benefit to fitness and reproduction, or it's selected against, right?
So you would expect like evolution to take place where energy is more efficient. So.
Yeah, and I don't actually know for humans how to answer that. I know they've looked at this kind of relationship between energy conversion and the mitochondria and a lot of other organisms. And in fact, there is selection to make it more efficient in ectotherms, for example, because in that case, that waste is it's not really generating heat or much heat, or the heat's not useful to the organism. In this case, I don't know, we'd have to think about both sides. It would have to depend on where that evolution took place in a cold or a warm climate. But I mean, I guess the short end of it is that this is something that we produce a lot of heat. And so by virtue of us being alive on the planet today, we'd have to surmise that it's not necessarily beneficial, but at least it hasn't knocked us out of the race, right? So yeah, that's an interesting question. Let me think about that one a little more too. Maybe the advantages of being able to generate heat when you're really cold outweigh the disadvantages when you're hot. And then we have these other mechanisms to compensate for when we're hot too. So yeah, that's a good way to think about it though. Like, why the heck do we produce so much heat when we move around? We're good at producing heat. And it's good too. I mean, that can be advantageous in other places like sleeping at night and things like that. So cool. So that's what muscles do generally. And to do this, these muscle tissues possess 4 important properties. And this is something that we're going to come back to over and over again in this unit. So we're going to talk about this, and we're going to do a little activity with this. The first special property of muscle tissue is that they contract. No other tissue in the body I'm just running through and seeing if there's an acceptance to that, but no other tissue in the body can make itself shorter. And they do this through the action of what's called myofilaments that contain these 2 different kinds of proteins, actin or myosin. Like I said, I'm not going to get into the details of how that works. We'll save that for another class. But the takeaway here is I want you to know that muscles can make themselves get shorter. Now, they don't do this randomly, although they can under situations of certain pathological situations, but they do this because they're also what's called excitable. And that means that they receive messages from nerve cells that say, hey, contract, and then the muscle contracts. So basically, excitability is the fact that this tissue listens and does what it's told from the central nerve, or from, I shouldn't say just central, but from the nervous system. So those nerve signals end up there. These are electrical impulses. We're going to cover this later in the semester. And those nerve signals tell those muscles to get shorter, and they do. Now, the muscles can get shorter, which means that unless they can also get longer, then they would always be short. And that wouldn't do you much good. So they have a quality also called extensibility. And this means that the muscle tissue can be stretched, right? And so anytime you're contracting a muscle, you're generally stretching another muscle. And that muscle is called the antagonist. We'll cover that in more detail. But just to give an example, if I'm going to contract my bicep here, right? I'm just going to show off my beach muscles to the class. If I'm contracting my bicep here, that means that my tricep is being stretched while I'm doing that. When I extend my arm, I'm contracting that tricep, and my bicep is stretched, right? So that's a really straightforward example of one muscle contracting and another stretching. And that muscle can stretch on the other side because it has this quality called extensibility. It means it can stretch without breaking. Now, lots of things can stretch without breaking and be really long. So for example, think of something like a silly putty or saltwater taffy or something. You see it can stretch and stretch and stretch and stretch and stretch, right? It's to a certain point it will break, but it can stretch really far. Those things have a quality called extensibility. But the problem with that is then you stretch it and then you got a really long piece of putty or a really long piece of taffy. And maybe you don't want that long anymore. It's just long and it's like stuck being long. Muscle tissues have one other property that allows them to go back to their original shape, and that is elasticity. So that is the property like a rubber band, right? So muscles are more like a rubber band than a piece of taffy. They're extensible, they can stretch, but they also, because of their internal structure, pull back to their original length, which is called their resting length in the case of skeletal muscle. So these 4 properties are special to muscle tissues, and they allow the muscle tissues to do all of this cool stuff they do for us, right? They can contract, they can get smaller, and they do this after receiving a signal from the nervous system. They can stretch without breaking, and then after they're stretched, they have recoil, and they'll go back to what's called the resting length. So these are some really kind of specific characteristics of muscle tissue we can kind of visualize happening. And that's exactly what you're going to do now. Let me just take a quick count here. I've got 3, 6, 9, 12, 15, 18, 21, 24, 28 people. That's perfect because 28 divided by 4 is 7. So you're going to work in groups of 7, and I'll count those off in just a second. And you're going to have exactly 5 minutes to prepare some sort of demonstration to the class to explain one of these 4 muscle properties of muscle cells. So what students have done in the past with this, and you in 251, you guys did this. Well, you were online, so I don't remember how we did for this. I keep picking on the students who are in 251 here. Oh, Dan, you were in 251 too. We did this. You should be familiar with this. you can make some kind of skit. You can just demonstrate this somehow. You can use props. I don't care. Just be creative and think of a way you can express this idea to the rest of the class in a way that will remember it. You have no more than a minute. Generally, these skits take a lot less than that, but you have got up to a minute to just give a demonstration. It's helpful if you have a narrator and you explain what different people represent. So you can have like people representing different parts of the tissue or whatever. It's super ridiculous, but after this class, I guarantee you remember those 4 properties of the muscle tissue, and you'll be ready to answer that on your next quiz or exam because I always ask about this. So remember, we have our 4 properties here. So we're going to have the contractility group is going to be, I'm just going to block you off. We'll have from Brooke down to Olivia, and from Michaela down to Abby. You 7 will be in that group. Then I'm going to have excitability. Let's just do first 7 here. So from Karime, 1, 2, 6, 7, down to Dan is going to be excitability. Then extensibility will be all of you in the back row. And then we'll throw Grace in there with you. And then everyone left over here, from Ethan down and then from Ella down, will be in the last group, which is elasticity. That sound okay? All right, you got 5 minutes. Yeah, actually, this is kind of bad planning on my part to have you all in a row. I apologize, but you can bring your chairs around or do whatever you need to do.
It could be like, just do like a domino, like push someone and then push the other person. You have some people be the nurse and then also push it towards the end. What?
Yeah, I like the signifies of their signals. I like it.
So it could be like a wave towards the end.
Basically, we're gonna do extraction muscle, and then we're gonna reinforce so we're gonna have 2 groups because of that. Small leg towards the area, they have a line. Yeah, because it says elasticity is actively stretch the muscle. So we have to start.
I like it.
Yeah, we're doing like
Oh, okay. Yeah, I was like, I cannot.
you'll catch me guys.
Yep. That's what I was hoping for too.
What do you guys think of the wave?
I think we do the wave, and then in the end, someone follows, and the other person goes on, and the other person
Probably forgot.
Wait, say it again.
Just we're all gonna do the wave except for the last person. Like, does a, like, trust, or the second to last person, I guess. Does a trust fall, like falling backwards into the person's dog box contraction.
So, who's the,
Sound familiar to you, man?
is the nursing?
Contraction.
I guess the nerve signal is everyone until those last 2. It's like the transition of the signals, isn't it?
Okay.
Yeah.
And how's it going for you?
Okay.
Do you guys do the muscle?
Yeah, I got a picture. I don't think you were
And be sure that you can identify the That sounds good. It's pretty straightforward, but don't overthink it. And this is how's the plan? Pick someone That's not movie so lucky. Okay. How are you going to do that with all 7?
That's what I always say.
The rest of us can do that.
Think about how you can get everyone in on that. Year was.
Yeah. You mean like the word excitability or the?
Like, there's the word like the size and, like, just make sure that there's track actions and like slide.
Okay, I like that.
And then that's the okay.
Make sure you can identify like what that person, like say what they are. Okay, sounds great. And then let's see, this group was
Excitability.
excitability. That's right. What's your plan here?
We're doing the wave and then they're trust falling, the signal going and then contraction.
Dang, you're just really doing what you're told there. Okay, and make sure you can explain what each person in that represents, what their role is.
Yeah, that's what we said.
Okay, I like it. I like it. I like the trust fall idea. That's risky. All right, you got about 30 seconds, everyone, and we'll come up. All right, are we good to go? Okay, so I'd like to do this, I think in an order that we would kind of find these events in a muscle, although remember that's just kind of constantly happening over and over again. But let's start off with excitability. Yes, you guys are up first. Yeah, give it up. Go wherever you're comfortable, do your thing. The classroom is your oyster.
All the way down here. You're in front of me. Sorry.
And we can turn that off too. Let me turn that off. But here, we just do this while everyone's presenting this.
I'm in trouble or something. You know what I mean?
There we go. And here, we'll even before you do anything, here, let me sneak behind you. Check this out.
Trip over there.
There you go. Look at that. It's like being in the theater. All right, excitability, take it away.
Okay, so we are all nerves except the last two of us who are muscle.
And tell us a little more about like the trust fall we saw at the end. What does that represent?
Just like the muscle contraction
Okay.
coming together from the nerve impulse.
Okay, good. And why did you pick a trust fall? Of all the, like, you could have done a lot of things to demonstrate that. Why a trust
Where
fall?
did you?
It was like a domino effect already, so it seemed the most logical step.
That makes sense, yeah. And I guess the point too is that the muscle's doing what it's told, right? And the trust fall is kind of like that, like you say fall and you fall. Good. One minor thing here is that remember as you're going, as a signal is traveling down a nerve, that's all one cell. So that wave that goes down is like the electrical impulse. Just a tiny clarification is that all of you will be parts of that same axon of one neuron rather than different neurons. So it's continuous. We'll cover that later in the semester, but I'll make sure you have that. All right, so our nerve impulse went, told the muscle to contract. Let's give it up for excitability. Good job, guys. Woo! And then, now that the muscle is contracting, let's learn about contractility. Yeah, somebody's stoked for contractility. I like it. That's my favorite property of muscles. I love it.
Okay. So we have our myosin, and we have our actin, and then we have our muscle contractor over there. So our actin and myosin are working together to cause the muscle contraction.
Good. Let's do that one more time. Show us again. So you're demonstrating. You're showing us
I'm
what's
like
happening in the body.
flexing
Good. You're flexing.
flexing her
Good.
sorry.
Good. And what is the actin doing here?
They're sliding.
they're sliding. Huh? Good. And what's the end result of those actin myosin filaments sliding against each other? Contracting. Good, good. Excellent. Let's give it up for contraction. So in muscle contraction, we have these two filaments. And what's important to note is that the filaments themselves actually don't contract. They stay the same length. They just slide along each other and provide more overlap. And that's what makes the whole muscle shorter. Now again, we're not going to get to too much detail about that. I'll talk about it a little bit later. But I just want to bring it up since that group did such a nice job of demonstrating the sliding filament theory of muscle contraction. Love it. Now our muscle's contracted. Next, we need extensibility. Which group? I forget if that was you guys in the back corner. Yeah, come on up, extensibility.
Am I a part of this or am I?
Yeah, you're talking to talk.
Alright.
I heard
Nothing but there.
Yeah. Okay. Oh, you're in first? Yeah, you first. Alright,
And then, okay, so in this position, the muscle tissue has stretched out to the full capacity that it can.
Okay.
And so then, in this case, we would want to coexist with the other property, which is the elasticity component, so that it can recoil.
Nice segue. Good, good, good. In this scenario, what if each of these individual people that are they're getting longer and shorter? What are you guys?
fibers.
Yeah, there's
Sir, who said it? Who said it? Sarcomere, yes. So this is great. We haven't covered this yet, but these long muscle fibers are composed of something called sarcomeres, and we'll talk about this in just a moment. But those are the functional units of muscle fibers. These are the things that get longer and shorter, right? And so sarcomeres, make yourselves longer. Stick your arms out and stretch out. Get extensible, right? Those sarcomeres are getting bigger, and now the sarcomeres can contract. I know that's not your demonstration, but go ahead and contract your sarcomeres, you get shorter, and they get closer together. And that's how the muscle can get shorter and longer. Good. I know your point was extensibility, though. You did a great job demonstrating that. So let's leave us in the extensible position. So one more time, sarcomeres get stretched out. Okay. Now we've got this muscle tissue. It's really stretched. Let's give it up for extensibility. Good job. And now we want to bring that muscle back to resting state. And so we need one last special property, and that is elasticity. Good.
You guys just saw them do it, so we'll just do it again.
All right, and what are each of those people here represent?
This is a sarcomere.
Good, okay. And all together, what is the sarcomere? Especially from Reese, Kath, and Michaela here, what do we call that long thing composed of these sarcomeres in a line? Anyone know that?
Myo?
Yeah, it's a muscle fiber, yeah. Which is the same as a muscle, well, I guess technically, well, I'll just call it a muscle fiber for now. We'll get the details in a second. Yep, okay, sorry, didn't mean to steer your thunder, Ella, go ahead.
And we're gonna recoil and it gets shortened, just to a relaxing position.
Now you're back to where you started, right? Now we have another an impulse from a nerve come up and tell you to contract. Excellent. Give it up for these guys. So one thing to note is that the resting position of a muscle is kind of in between all the way contracted and stretched out. So for example, resting position for like, let's say my bicep is about like here. So when you're in resting position, you can still stretch, you can still extend, and you can contract. It's kind of in the middle. All the way contracted is one end, and then all the way stretched is the other. Good, good, good. Excellent work, everybody. I think everyone should give it up for yourselves, the whole class, really. That was one of the more outstanding demonstrations of the four properties of muscle tissue that I've ever seen. And I've done this in a bunch of classes, so you guys, when you see anyone, like if you have friends that took this class last year, you can just like rub it in their face. Like, our demonstration was way better than yours. Suckers. Okay, so just to review, We've got our 4 special properties of muscle, of all muscle types. Hold on, we're getting there. Projector's just warming up. Those 4 types, you know this now: contractility, excitability. Excitability is sometimes called irritability or responsiveness. I generally use the term excitable because, I don't know, I'd rather think of something as excitable than irritable. Extensibility, of course, the ability to be stretched, and then elasticity. So make sure you know those 4 muscle properties. Be sure you kind of understand it. We're not getting into the molecular basis of these properties, but I really want you to take away is why it's functionally important that muscle tissue can do all of that stuff. Like I said, it's a question that I almost invariably ask on exams or quizzes. Cool. So that's all the stuff that muscle does. Let's start getting into what the muscles are, where they are, different muscles in the body. But before we do, let me pause, see what questions you have. All right, some terminology before we get into this, and this has come up already. If you see the prefix of a word myo or mice, this just simply refers to muscle. So myosin is a kind of muscle fiber, or myofilament refers to a filament in a muscle. So just keep that in mind as we're looking through these terms. If you see those prefixes, that means muscle. The word sarco generally refers to muscle as well. This actually refers to flesh, but we have something, for example, called the sarcomere, right? So if you see sarco, again, that refers to muscle. Now, there's a couple parts of the muscle cell that have special names when they're on a muscle cell. We have the sarcolemma, which is simply the plasma membrane of the cell. So we didn't get into this in too much detail in this course, but you've all seen this in other courses. The plasma membrane, of course, is that lipid bilayer surrounding all the cells. In a muscle, it's got a special name, sarcolemma. All cells, of course, contain cytoplasm. It's kind of the liquid inside the cell where all the other organelles and whatnot float around. In muscle cells, we call that sarcoplasm. So if you see myo, mice, or sarco, we're generally talking about muscles. Now, this is a bit of a review. We covered it in the histology section of our course, but just to remind you, there's 3 types of muscle tissue. We have cardiac muscle, skeletal muscle, and smooth muscle. We went into that in some detail. You identified these different cell types under a microscope. Remember that skeletal and cardiac are striated. And actually, the reason that they're striated is because of the patterns of those overlapping filaments within the sarcomere. This is an aside. Remember that skeletal muscle is multinucleated, which is pretty cool. Smooth muscle has this more kind of like irregular pattern that you see here and is not striated. Each of these muscle types, they differ in where we find them. The cell structure and function is slightly different in each. In the way that they're regulated differs. So even though they're all kinds of muscle, for example, the cardiac muscle is found only in the heart. Skeletal muscle is found throughout the body in conjunction with voluntary movements, whereas smooth muscle is also found throughout the body in conjunction with involuntary movements. And the way that they contract and some of their other properties differ as well. Cool. This is a little bit more detail on this. Actually, I just went over this without, I should have actually saved all of the things that I was talking about for this slide. So I'll just put this slide up. This is basically everything I just covered in one slide. Remember, the cardiac muscle tissue is striated, but remember that this is also involuntary. We can't consciously control our heart rate. Of course, there's things we can do to raise and lower our heart rate, but we can't think about making our heart go faster or slower and make it happen like we can with, say, our bicep or our quadriceps of our leg or something like that. I think I've covered all of that already. Your textbook has nice tables and figures about all of this stuff as well, a lot of which we've covered in the histology section. So that's a general gist of muscle tissue. What we're going to spend all of our time now pretty much on this unit is talking about one of these 3 types, and that is going to be skeletal muscle. We've got a lot of them in our bodies. We're going to learn where they are, what they do, and how they do that. See some people still typing, getting notes. I want to make sure you've got this down. We good? Questions? my favorite kind of muscle. No one has ever asked me that in my life. Pass. All right, skeletal muscle, the organ. This is what it looks like. So we're just pulling off this handsome fellow's bicep here, right? And I want to show you what the structure of this is from the whole tissue down to the cellular level. So first notice here that the muscle tissue is here in the arm and that it's attached to the bone via what's called tendons. And this is dense, regular connective tissue. So remember I said that muscle tissue is made up of both muscle and connective tissue. This is dense, regular connective tissue that binds muscles to the bone. We'll see how that works in a little more detail coming up. But your muscle is kind of broken up, and basically you can think of a muscle as a tube inside a tube inside a tube. I'm going to start with the smallest tube here, and this is a myofibril. These myofibrils are composed of those repeating units of sarcomeres, right? So when you're standing up here, and the groups are nicely demonstrating sarcomeres getting longer and then shorter doing this, those are the myofibrils composed of those sarcomeres in sequence. And we have a whole bunch of myofibrils bound together in something called a muscle fiber or a muscle cell. So this is one cell containing all of these myofibrils, right? So I actually should have done this. When I said before that the sarcomeres were in a chain together, they actually form myofibrils. Myofibril. And then that forms, in turn, a muscle fiber. So you've got bundles of myofibrils together in a muscle fiber, and then you've got a whole bunch of these muscle fibers or cells bound together in something called a fascicle. A fascicle is a bundle of these muscle cells together, and that's surrounded by connective tissue. We're going to learn about that connective tissue in a second. And then you get a whole bunch of these fascicles bound together in the muscle tissue, along with blood vessels and nerves and things like that. And so we've got this tube and a tube and a tube. So again, the myofibril is the smallest thing. That's the sarcomeres in sequence. This is what gets shorter. A whole bunch of myofibrils in a muscle fiber or muscle cell. Those are synonymous. Cells are bound together in a fascicle, and then a whole bunch of fascicles are bound together in a muscle. So these skeletal muscles, as I mentioned, they make up nearly half of your body weight, and they are most often voluntary, but not always. And their general job is they attach and pull the skeleton, but they can also move other tissues as well. So for example, you have all of these really complex muscles in your face that don't pull on bones and create movement in that way, but rather they're attached to underneath your skin so that you can make all of the super complex and important facial expressions, right? So humans, one other thing we're really good at besides sweating is expressing our emotions and thoughts through the way our faces look, which why it sucks kind of wearing a mask all the time, because it's actually a really important way that we communicate with each other. We have an intricate kind of set of muscles that allow us to do that, which is pretty cool. And as I mentioned, each skeletal muscle is this organ, and it contains multiple tissue types. So muscle tissue, of course, and then it also includes connective tissue. I mentioned this briefly. Epithelial tissue, so in the form of the lining of the blood vessels that go through it. And as I mentioned, nerves are in these organs as well. So let's talk about this in a little more detail, and I specifically want to talk I don't know if that's recorded, but we'll do our best. We'll figure it out. I'll go back to it later and see what it saved and what it didn't. Next, we have the paramycium. This is the connective tissue that surrounds each fascicle. So that's the next one down here. And I can go back to our handsome fella doing a curl. and he can show off. The paramycium is going to surround this bundle of muscle fibers in the form of a fascicle. So we've got paramycium around that. And then, on an even smaller level, we have something called endomycium. Endomycium is the connective tissue that wraps individual cells. So remember, this word mice refers to muscles. Endo means in, para means around, and epi means on. You can kind of think about it logically. The endo is inside, it's surrounding the smallest unit, each individual cell. Then those cells are bound in a fascicle that's surrounded by paramycium. And then all of those fascicles are bound together and surrounded by epithelium. I can show you a diagram of what that looks like here. There's another nice diagram. Again, we can see a muscle. This case, something coming off what's that going to be? That's going to be your quadricep muscle coming off of the greater trochanter of your femur. And here you've got the epimycium surrounding the whole thing. You've got this fascicle that's wrapped by this other connective tissue called paramycium. And then within that, each individual muscle fiber is wrapped by endomycium. You can see that kind of in between. Now, when the muscle fibers contract, what happens is that the muscle fibers actually end up pulling on those connective tissue. And as I said, this epimycium is continuous with the tendon, and that provides force that pulls on the bone that's associated with that muscle. These tissue sheaths also are important because they carry blood vessels to the muscle cells and nerves as well. And they also provide some of the elasticity we talk about with muscle tissues, as they help bring that muscle back to its resting length after it's been stretched.
So is the tendon 100% that epimycium?
Is a tendon 100%?
Or is there any muscle in there at all?
There is no muscle in there. It's continuous with the epimycium. The epimycium basically transitions from being like the tissue surrounding the muscle, and then as you get down here, there's less and less muscle in there, and more tendon, and then it attaches to the bone via that tendon.
Okay, so if we were to take apart the tendon, though, we'd only see epimycium.
That's correct. Yep, you'd see that dense, regular connective tissue. So on that note, actually, let's take a look at some tendons. So I'm not going to get into too much detail. You're not going to learn the names of particular tendons in the body, but I want you to know what they are and what they do. So this is actually a human arm. This is like a cadaver. You can see these tendons here. They are big, and they are thick, and they are strong. And especially in your forearm, you've got a lot of tendons that control the movement at your wrist and your fingers. Anyone who's ever eaten, for example, a drumstick on a chicken, and you get like that long stringy thing, and it's not quite meat, but it's not bone. You're like, what is going on there? That's tendon. And depending, and you can see how those tendons kind of come off the end of those muscles, because they're going to connect those muscles to the bone. So the image you see here corresponds to what you see here in the diagram. You have all of these tendons that allow the muscles in your forearm to control movement in your wrist and your hand and your fingers. And so they're important. They're connecting this muscle to the bone. They're dense, regular fibrous connective tissue, as I said, and they essentially provide the attachment point almost in all cases, in the majority of cases, between the muscle and the bone that they are connecting to. Now, tendons can take a different form. Often they're these long kind of stringy structures like this. They're long and skinny. But in some cases, this dense, regular connective tissue that extends from the epimycium can form these kind of big, flat surfaces rather than a string. And that's something called an aponeurosis. Aponeurosis you see here, for example, connecting all of these muscles to the spine. It's this big flat sheet of connective tissue. So in some cases, rather than the muscle pulling on the bone via a string, it's more pulling on the bone via like a broad sheet. And we refer to that as aponeurosis. So aponeurosis is simply like a big flat tendon. It's also dense, regular connective tissue. It provides the same function generally, although it has a slightly different shape to it. So I want to make sure you know those terms as well.
Are we only going to see that in the back, like you see there?
No, there's other examples too. Yep. You've got like aponeuroses in your around surrounding your head as well, and a number of other places. Questions so far? Okay, let me see. I just want to see quickly how much I want to get into here. I'm going to do this one more slide, and then we'll wrap things up today. So I want to show you this. This is an image of muscle cells, and you can see, or excuse me, let me rephrase it, muscle tissue. That's an important distinction. And you can see the muscle fibers are these kind of orange things back here. They're not, the way this is stained, they're not very prominent. What I want you to notice is that there's all of these blood vessels that deliver nutrients and oxygen or remove waste and carbon dioxide from these cells. And what I really like about this image is that you see how all of these capillaries are, and all these blood vessels are kind of, what's the word I'm looking for? When something is not straight, but squiggly. Yeah, that's a scientific word for it. They're really squiggly. That's because this muscle is at resting state. And so if it's going to stretch at all, then these capillaries need to be able to stretch with it. So you see this cool pattern where they're kind of bound up on each other, or not bound, they're kind of wavy like this, so that when the muscle stretches, they can stretch out and keep delivering blood and nutrients and oxygen to those tissues without the blood vessels themselves break. So that's kind of cool, right? The takeaway message here is that each of these muscles is, we have arteries that are delivering blood and nutrients to the blood and oxygen nutrients to the cells, and we have veins, of course, removing the waste, and we have a nerve that's innervating a group of muscles. And we'll see what that looks like in a little bit, especially when we talk about the nervous system. Not all I want to say about that. Yep, the idea there, just reiterating how this muscle tissue is composed of muscle cells, but also blood vessels and nerves. And we can't see the nerve on this cell. I don't have a good image of a nerve on there. All right, I want to wrap that up for today. Just make a couple quick announcements. We're going to talk about all of this cool stuff, the shapes of muscles, and then we'll get into tomorrow in your lab. We are going to get into details of the muscles of the lower limb, and you'll see those, and we're going to get back to our cats tomorrow. Remember that in lab you have a quiz on the appendicular skeleton. It's 10 points, and we'll cover, we're going to have bones, and you're going to name them and parts of them and what they articulate with. Same format as previous quizzes. Remember, that's tomorrow in lab. Also, note that Chase is not going to have a tutoring session tomorrow. Instead, she's going to have one next week, Sunday, from 12 to noon. She's going to be in the lab room, and that's going to be a review session specifically for the lab practical, which you have a week from tomorrow. So just note that her weekly meeting time is going to change to accommodate the practical next week. That seems to make a lot more sense because we just had the exam in here, so it probably makes more sense to spend time prepping for the lab practical. Also, remember, I have open hours today from noon to 2 in the lab room. I'll be there. Just come by anytime. You don't need to make an appointment or let me know. You can if you want, but I'll be there. Just come down if you need anything. Otherwise, I got a couple of quick questions for you, and I will stick around and answer anything other questions that you have for me, and I look forward to seeing you in lab tomorrow.